Thank you for flying Science Airlines. Please be certain that your tray tables are in their upright locked position, your seatbelts fastened, your seats in the firmly upright position, and get ready because takeoff starts in 1 minute. Guess what, passengers of science? The show starts in less than 30 seconds. Takeoff is imminent. It's time.
Okay.
Alrighty. Hello, everyone. So that was the test run of Science Airlines. It's really corny, and I actually used my Yamaha keyboard for that. If you're wondering, if you want to know how old I am, there you go. All right. So today, for this week in BS, I'm super excited to have my special guest. Please introduce yourself and tell us all about you, sir.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Brian Dean Abramson, and I am the author of Vaccination, and Immunization Law. I have to hold this up for a while before it'll actually show up. I wrote this after many years of interest in the subject that began when I was a law clerk on the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which hears appeals from vaccine injuries, which are actually all required by law to be brought in the United States Court of Federal Claims. But in the course of researching this, I have come across numerous areas of law, things that people don't really even think about that are impacted by this rather enormous public policy carve-out in support of the principles of vaccines and vaccination. And I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about them here tonight.
Well, I'm excited to have you. So I remember you were popping up on one of my, when we were talking on Twitter. So I was mentioning what that kind of ideas I had about removing certain type of government-funded things and basic societal things that's that we have within a civilization where multiple... It's showing 2 live hangouts. People have had their channel striked by YouTube for that. Oh, crap. Let me fix that one. 2 streams? Let me see. Let me look on my YouTube channel really quickly. You know, that's just probably how it would go, wouldn't it? I only see 1. All right.
I don't have one, do I?
I don't think so.
I could log out of YouTube and see if that does anything.
Let me pull up Restream. This might affect... See, you know, it's not a show that I host unless something weird is happening on any given moment. So, let me... Okay, so I actually need to bring this over here. Let me see if I can fix this really quickly.
No problem.
Alrighty. I think... There are two streams. Okay.
Don't cut off the streams.
Yeah, that's what they say.
Total protonic reversal.
I don't know how it's doing two streams. That's weird. Okay, so I guess maybe it's. Let me shut off that one. All right, that should shut off one of them. I think I just shut off the one going to YouTube events. I think that was. I probably had two because I'm an overachiever and I was trying to do a thing. So I'm over on here now. Okay, I think that fixed the two stream thing. All right. Sorry.
No problem at all.
All right. So now that we've now I fixed that double stream. That's so strange. All right. Anywho, so Brian, so tell me, okay, first of all, do you want to talk about where you were yesterday? You want to start with that?
I do. Yesterday morning, I went to a hearing in the United States House of Representatives Energy and Commerce Committee. They have a subcommittee on health, and the hearing was on the measles outbreak that is currently going on in multiple states around the United States, most heavily in Washington, where it's been reported the most. But, there are 100 and something cases of measles right now that are active. And this in a country that at one point had eliminated measles through a robust vaccination program, to the extent that there were entire years where there were 0 reported measles cases. So the fact that this has come back directly connects to the law as it governs vaccination. The areas where people, where children are coming down with measles are places where states allow for exemptions based on philosophical reasons primarily, and those exemptions are taken advantage of to a fairly high rate relative to the population, with 3 or 4% of the population saying, okay, I'm going to express that I have some philosophical objection to vaccination, and I'm not going to vaccinate my children. And that is directly correlated to the outbreak of measles. It's very similar to an outbreak of chickenpox that happened last year in North Carolina in a population where people took advantage of exemptions.
It seems like your video has gone.
Well, I'm here. If you can hear the audio, that's what really matters.
Oh goodness. If this wasn't a thing, I swear I fixed this. I had this all set and it was working great, and then it goes away. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. So.
Well, the important thing is we can still kind of get the conversation out.
Yes. I go to fix one thing and another thing goes wrong. This is what we call live broadcasting, doesn't it? All right. So is the other stream gone? So I sometimes have a problem with two streams first thing in the morning. Oh my goodness. Okay. I think the other stream is gone. Hopefully that's been fixed. I'm not certain what's happened with your video. Let me switch to this one. It's not registering it for some reason on my giant monitor that
I can see myself.
You can see yourself, yeah. But
so I know that I look good. That's the important thing.
Yeah, you do, and you have a very nice tie.
Oh, thank you.
So, oh my goodness. All right, so since we can't see Brian, please remember what he looked like a few seconds ago.
Use your imagination.
Use your imagination. Oh gosh, isn't that the thing? All right. So anyway, so you went to the congressional hearing. What were some of the things that you found pretty shocking?
Well, there wasn't anything that I found actually really shocking. The thing that the interesting contrast to me was all of the Congress members, and I think there were about a dozen members there from both parties. All along the road, expressed their concern that vaccination rates were dropping and that there was misinformation going out there. And the witnesses were very good. There was one director from the NIH and one director from the CDC express the safety of the vaccines and the degree to which vaccination is necessary to prevent both the recipients from becoming ill and to prevent them from transferring illnesses to people who, for medical reasons, cannot be vaccinated. And it seemed like everybody who was on a panel for the members of the House of Representatives understood and agreed that vaccines are safe and effective. And the question is, how do we convey to people that they should vaccinate their children?
Right.
But there was a large gallery of people who were gathered as observers, and some of them were clearly from the community in opposition to vaccination. And at the end, after the meeting was gavelled to a close, a lot of them started shouting things about the testimony. They said you were lied to, and this proceeding was disgusting, and repeating various tropes about vaccines being harmful. So that was a very interesting experience. It's interesting to see people kind of congregate around views like that, which is something that is very much more possible now in this sort of age of the internet, where, first of all, people who have fringe ideas can find other people who share those ideas and connect with them and gather together with them. And then secondly, where people who, for whatever reason, whether it's nefarious or otherwise, can develop, you can say anything. You can put anything in a picture with a caption and say this is what happened, and put it out there, and it will get spread around. As Churchill said, a lie spreads around the world in the time it takes the truth to put on its pants.
Right. I think, we were talking before about Andrew Wakefield and how that kind of spawned all of this. I know when he came out with his paper, the Daily Mail actually published that he had come out with this new article in the journal. And so for the general population, their first exposure to it was the Daily Mail, which is considered of a rag mag to a degree. So,
I do want to give a bit of historical context to it. When the very first vaccine, the smallpox vaccine, was developed over 200 years ago, it was a very dangerous vaccine. Now, smallpox would come through a town and kill a sixth of the population or more. So when a vaccine came along that, if everyone was vaccinated, the vaccine itself would immunize them, but the vaccine would kill a 16th of the population or something like that.
Right.
Some people said this is great, it's going to save a lot of lives. And some people say, well, I don't want to be vaccinated because the vaccine itself is dangerous. And I think, there was organized opposition to vaccination and vaccination mandates from the invention of the technology. Right. And there's a degree to which I think there's sort of a genetic predisposition that's been carried down from generation to generation, where people have either a personal memory or something that was passed down to them from some ancestor of a time when vaccines were a lot less safe than they are today. So there's kind of an inclination for people to think that there are potential problems and not to be aware, because who's really aware of this outside of people who are practicing in the field, of how many hundreds of millions of vaccines are actually administered every year, and how very, very few bad reactions there are. Right. And the fact that the most prevalent bad reaction to vaccines is when you get a little swelling and soreness in the arm where the injection occurred, and that goes away in a day or two.
Okay.
Yeah. But Wakefield did, the reporting on Wakefield did cause a new crisis.
Yes. He really did. And the thing that kind of makes me nuts about that is that the essentially the media doesn't take enough responsibility about what it is that's going on, what they present. So, as I was mentioning before, I'm sorry, I think I finally canceled the other stream, by the way, guys. So I think I stopped that one. I think I did. So hopefully this is the only one that's going, and hopefully Brian's visuals will come back in a bit. If not, you can check him out on Twitter. But the thing that I find pretty striking, especially with the media, is the fact they don't have science literate journalists. They don't understand double-blind studies so much. They don't understand sample size. They don't understand conflicts of interest and things like that. So they'll see something and they'll just run with it because it gets a lot of headline. It makes a good clickbaity headline. And so
yes.
I kind of blame a lot of the media for the fact that anti-vaxxers are running around and doing this thing. And I'm like,
Well, in the United States, we have First Amendment. And the First Amendment, and I think people sometimes don't kind of appreciate this, the First Amendment protects false speech. It protects someone who wants to go out and say something that is scientifically untrue and argue that you should believe that this is in fact what's going on.
Yes.
That's not the case in every country. There are places where on the one hand, there are places where the media is controlled by the state and says false things all the time, and there's nothing to kind of prevent that. But there are countries where it is possible to impose consequences on the media for making false reports about health-related things or science-related things.
Right.
And there's a degree to which it hasn't been tested whether you could hold someone liable, not necessarily the reporter who reports a story, but if someone, a doctor, for example, goes around like Wakefield making claims about something, and those claims turned out to be harmful to a particular person, a person who's medically incapable of receiving vaccination, and therefore became ill through a vector of someone who could have been vaccinated but wasn't, based on a false belief.
Right.
Then it hasn't really been tested the degree to which you can recover or impose some kind of penalty on whoever is spreading a false belief.
Yes, I mean, and not only that, I kind of get in the idea of what kind of damages would be involved if you were to actually sue somebody for causing a loved one. For instance, if they had cancer and they had a compromised immune system, or they had HIV, or elderly, or autoimmune disease, or an allergy even to the components of a vaccine. What kind of how could that be going and come about, and what kind of damages would somebody be looking at if that precedent were to be set, do you think?
If it was possible, and it might be, to obtain damages in that case, usually the law allows the damages to match the costs of medical expenses for treating someone who's been injured wrongly in this case. There's usually some consideration for pain and suffering, for loss of income through wages, or, for example, loss of the ability to work for a time. And we have that extremely well quantified, actually, through the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. The program compensates people who are actually injured by a vaccine, which is a very rare thing, but it does happen on occasion. And they have numerous decisions where they've said this is how much the value of the medical care is worth, this is how much the loss of potential wages is worth, how much the potential death of a loved one is worth. And we have also a long history of court cases examining injuries, iatrogenic injuries that people obtain through sloppy medical practices and the like.
Right.
So that is certainly something that's determinable and calculable.
Right. I'm curious also. Let me see. I'm trying to see if I can't bring back your video some other means. That's not what I was trying to do. Never mind on that. I was trying to see if I could bring your video back some other way, but it doesn't seem that I can. So when we're talking about...
Well, now your video is something's... Something's up with your video. It went blank for a minute.
Oh, it was for a minute? Of course.
I did want to mention the adenovirus outbreak in New Jersey and Maryland last year. Mm-hmm. And I think this is relevant because there was an outbreak of adenovirus, which is generally not as harmful as a lot of the viruses for which people are routinely vaccinated. Mm-hmm. But in this case, there were a number of deaths. Specifically, in New Jersey, the virus centered on a children's hospital, mm-hmm. and 35 people became ill, and 11 of them died.
Right.
And all 11 of the deaths were children who had immunological disorders. There were also 35 people who became ill in Maryland, and it was centered around the University of Maryland campus at Annapolis, I believe. And of those, one person died, and the one person who died had Crohn's disease, which is an immunological disorder. Mm-hmm. And I say that, first of all, because people are not vaccinated for adenovirus. A vaccine mm-hmm. exists, but it's not licensed for use in the United States. So the only people who actually receive it are members of the military. So this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like when you have a population that is completely unvaccinated for something which mm-hmm. poses a threat to people with a specific vulnerability, and there is an outbreak of that disease. Mm-hmm. And if that population, if the same population was completely unvaccinated against measles, for example, or chickenpox, mm-hmm. then the same children would have been vulnerable. There would have been a direct vector to them. And because those are in fact, more contagious and deadlier diseases, you can guarantee that there would have been more deaths and more illness caused by that.
Right.
And the parents of the children who died, of course, are suing the hospital. And
yes.
The hospital is liable because of, or they're asserting that it's liable. I'm not in a position to say whether they are, but it didn't take certain precautions that it
right.
could have taken mm-hmm. Against. And you don't think necessarily about taking precautions against the spread of adenovirus because it's mm-hmm. rare, mm-hmm. and you don't think about taking precautions necessarily mm-hmm. against measles or mumps or rubella or other viruses like that because mm-hmm. the population tends to be vaccinated against them.
Right, right.
Yeah, but all of us are exposed to measles from time to time. We just don't know it because most people have been vaccinated, and therefore they have the immunity built up in their system, and they don't know as they go through their daily life what kinds of infections are invading their body and attempting to take over their cells and reproduce themselves with it. Right.
Gosh, okay. So I couldn't get the video back, so I just thought I'd put my little patrons up there and say thank you.
Nice.
So it's not like a big giant black screen because I'm like, it's not equal on both sides. It feels weird. So anyway,
it fills the space.
To fill up the space of it, so it's okay. So what I'll do is when I make a little thumbnail, I'll go back and put your picture up there and say, check this out. Here he is. So when we're talking about measles and that sort of thing, there's so
mm-hmm.
much there's so much misconception associated with that particular disease. It's extremely contagious. It can be in the air for 2 hours after somebody infected leaves. And there was, I mentioned to you, there was a representative in Texas who says that he's not afraid of the measles because he has antibiotics. I'm just like, what in the heck and heck? Is this, you don't use antibiotics for that at all. I mean, that's not how that works. So, do you have, so you mentioned that when we were speaking before, that there
mm-hmm.
are a lot of loopholes that are in the law that allow people to get exemptions and that these need to be closed. Can you kind of get into that on what you think?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So there are three basic kinds of exemptions to vaccination. Every state and every jurisdiction that requires vaccines allows people to be exempt for medical reasons. Mm-hmm. And in order to demonstrate the need for a medical exemption, you usually have to have something signed off on from a medical professional. Mm-hmm. The standard usually is that the vaccine is contraindicated in accordance with the actual standards set forth by the manufacturer who tests the vaccine. Mm-hmm. And goes through a very lengthy regulatory process to get sale of the vaccine approved. So they have to determine what are the possible side effects or contraindications, indicate that in their paperwork that accompanies it. So that's the first way. And it is possible for medical exemptions to be misused. There's actually a doctor in California who has been vocally anti-vaccine, and he was very heavily penalized by the state regulatory agency for exempting a child who had not been, I believe, properly examined and who did not have contraindications for vaccination. So it's very rare for a medical professional to kind of wrongfully sign off on such an exemption, but that does happen, and it is something that needs to be policed. Mm-hmm. The other two kinds of exemptions are religious exemptions and philosophical exemptions. Mm. And historically, around the 1960s, a lot of new vaccines were being developed at that time, and there were certain groups that objected to vaccination on religious grounds. Mm. And they lobbied the states, and a lot of states over the next 10 to 15 years adopted various religious exemptions. Mm-hmm. And about, I believe it's 17 states, adopted philosophical exemptions. Mm-hmm. So a religious exemption generally requires that you either state or provide some evidence to the effect that you belong to a religious denomination that has an objection to vaccination based on their interpretation of their religious doctrine. Mm-hmm. And a philosophical exemption usually just requires someone to say, well, I disagree with vaccination.
Wow.
I have likened that to the sign you see in the men's room or in the bathroom at a restaurant saying employees must wash hands after using the bathroom. Imagine if you lived in a jurisdiction that said, we're going to allow a philosophical exemption to this rule of employees washing hands. If an employee has some personal belief that they feel they don't need to wash their hands, they can go right back to, being a line cook and peeling off the lettuce leaves to prepare your salad without washing their hands after going to the bathroom. Mm. And it's certainly possible that some restaurant employee somewhere would say, well, I heard on the internet that it's actually more infectious if you wash your hands, that actually the diseases are in the soap. So if you wash your hands, then that's going to make you more sick, and therefore I'm actually doing the right thing by not washing my hands. I go straight from the bathroom to the kitchen.
Oh, my gosh. Oh, no.
So it's the same principle to say that, well, we're going to have a philosophical exemption, and whether it's based in anything rational or reasonable, we're going to allow people to say, I just disagree with this, and I'm not going to do it. It's not something that we have in other areas of law. It's not something that we permit for drug use. There's a Supreme Court case about that. So if you have a philosophical belief that it's okay to use certain drugs, that doesn't get you out of state laws.
Yeah.
It doesn't get you out of paying taxes. It doesn't get you out of shoplifting if you claim that you have some belief that is somehow philosophically justified. So this is one of the only areas.
Or killing people, and it's like
Yeah, you could say I belong to some ancient Aztec religion, and human sacrifice is part of my belief system.
Yeah. I want to ask you really quickly, because you can actually sue somebody if they knowingly carry like HIV and infect you with it. So I kind of think, shouldn't there be some way to where you could, apply that to an infectious disease if you were able to isolate and definitively prove that you
were able to do that. And that's probably the biggest hurdle to something like that, is that with sexually transmitted diseases, it kind of It boils down to, or diseases transmitted by, for example, the sharing of needles. Right. It boils down to who are the people that you've engaged in those activities with.
Right.
With something like measles, where it can hang in the air for hours and hours, after a person, you don't know who's passed through the space, it is generally going to resolve to a problem of proof. And there's always a possibility that, especially if you have an outbreak, and there are a number of people who are infected, and you don't know which person gave it to which one, whether person A caught it from person B or vice versa. One of the things that came up in the congressional hearing that I was at was the fact that the CDC does a very good job of tracing patient zero for an outbreak. So there was an outbreak in New York among the Hasidic Jewish community of measles a few years ago, and it was also a community that had a low vaccination rate due to religious exemptions being claimed. And the outbreak was traced to a single person who had visited the country from Israel and brought measles with him from Israel, where there had been an outbreak at the time. So sometimes it is possible, if you can find a patient zero, if you can specifically isolate who came into the community. But then once you're within the community, you can't necessarily say, well, person A gave it to person B, gave it to person C, gave it to person D. You just know it started at this point and it spread at this rate. So whether it would be possible to sue the patient zero in that case and recover damages for the illness and injury that was experienced, it's something that wasn't done in that case, but that's certainly an open question, and it's an open question of law. I want to talk a little bit more about religious exemptions, though, because where there are not philosophical exemptions, a lot of religious exemptions are claimed, and that by itself is kind of problematic, because in order to claim a religious exemption in a lot of states, you just have to sign an affidavit or even just write out a declaration saying it's against my religious beliefs. And in fact, most major religious denominations in the world, the Roman Catholic Church and the Anglican Communion and the largest Protestant denominations and Jewish and Muslim denominations, those organizations or their leaders have issued statements saying vaccination is fine with us. We have no doctrinal issue with it. There's nothing in our scripture that says you shouldn't be vaccinated. Historically, there are only two religions that have been consistently against vaccination, and those are Jehovah's Witnesses and Christian Scientists. And their opposition to vaccination is part of and consistent with a larger opposition to a wide range of medical treatments. So when people who have no objection to any kind of surgery or procedure or medication, except they say that they have a religious objection to vaccination, to me, I think it's a bit suspect that, first of all, they claim that, and secondly, that they're allowed to. There was a case in 2017 in Florida, which is a very interesting case. There's a student who was attending a private school, and his parents asserted that they didn't want to have him vaccinated. The school said, we want your child to be vaccinated. The parents said, it's against our religion to vaccinate our child. And the school said, wait a minute, we are a religious school. The school was a religious school. It was of the same denomination as the parents. They said, we're the experts on what our doctrine requires. And we say that there's nothing in our doctrine which is against vaccination. And the parents took this to the court, and the court said, we're not going to get into this. The court isn't going to get into deciding who has the correct interpretation of a religious doctrine between people who disagree on what that doctrine is. And therefore, because mandatory vaccination is the standard, we're not going to allow the students to derogate from that. We're not going to allow them to not be vaccinated and attend the school. And the really interesting thing about that case, and see my picture is back.
I got a still up there because I figured out I could just do print screen and throw a picture up there. If you want to pause for a second and look in the camera and smile, I can take a better one.
Okay.
All right, 1, 2, 3. Okay, there. I'll put that one in. Keep going. Thank you, sir.
I am smiling. The thing about it that is kind of remarkable is if this student had been attending a public school and his parents had made the same argument and said it's against our religious belief, no one would have questioned it. It goes into this black box of you can't question if someone says, I have a belief in something. Then the courts, the agencies of government, they do not question that.
Right, right.
Now, there have been some cases where people have made claims, and it's been litigated as to whether, for example, what they were claiming was really a religious belief. Chiropractic ethics fall into this. There are a number of cases where people have claimed, well, I believe in chiropractic ethics, and therefore I don't want to be vaccinated. And the courts have said that's not a religion. So they don't allow religious exemptions on that basis. But if you belong to what is a recognized mainstream religion, and irrespective of whatever the doctrines of your religion actually are, you say, it is my religious belief that vaccination is not allowed by my religion, then that really doesn't get scrutiny, and it should.
Okay.
People shouldn't be allowed to abuse religion.
I want to stop for a second because there's somebody who doesn't know that if you're telling the truth or is bunk. So let me just reiterate. He practices vaccination law. He's written a book on it from Bloomberg Law. So Brian, our friend Brian here, actually was at a congressional hearing yesterday, and he actively works in vaccination law. So yes, he's telling the truth, and you can read his book. So. It's a very thick book, so it might take you a while to get through it. But if you're interested, check it out in the description. The link to his book is there.
The book itself is not pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine. The book is simply laying out all the different areas of law that have been kind of modified or altered to suit the existence of vaccines or regimes that exist because of vaccination. And you can't write a lot about vaccines without writing about the tremendous success that they have had. So, to someone who is kind of fervently anti-vaccine, it comes across as pro-vaccine. If you just say, well, the number of people who died from measles and diphtheria and rubella and all these other diseases dropped dramatically once vaccination was introduced. But that's just a historical fact, and it's kind of an easy to demonstrate historical fact that in places where vaccination rates drop, incidences of these diseases rise right away to match that. Right. And the same thing around the world, places where vaccination isn't prevalent or where certain diseases are not vaccinated against. That's the kind of immediate response to that.
So I know you had mentioned that Argentina has a new implementation that seems to be successful on mandatory vaccinations.
Argentina has imposed the most stringent vaccination requirement in the world, bar none. It has a very robust vaccination schedule. There are more vaccines required than there are in the United States. And you have to provide evidence of this full vaccination in order to begin school, in order to move up to the next grade in school, in order to attend college, in order to get a driver's license, a marriage license, a passport. So there are a tremendous number of privileges living in the state or living in the country that are made contingent on vaccination. So it was just enacted in December. It remains to be seen how effective the enforcement is, but given the very strong public policy that they've expressed there, it's likely to be very effective. And they've also...
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, can you get into the details specifically of what they're doing? I know you'd mentioned schools and grade levels.
Right. Like you have to show that you have the full contingent of vaccine in order to move from primary school to secondary school. in order to get into school in the first place, just to begin school, and then to move on to secondary school, and then to go to college, and then also, as you mentioned, to get a driver's license even.
Right.
And we don't have anything like that in the United States. And there's kind of a flip side to that, where they also are fully funding vaccination. So there's no cost to parents or vaccine recipients to receive vaccines, or there's going to be. And they've eliminated all taxes, imposition of taxes on vaccines in order to facilitate that. And that's really also, that's an issue everywhere where vaccination is required. It is potentially an issue in the United States. It's not just that we have exemptions to vaccination. It's also that there are costs associated with getting vaccinated, and the more that can be done to reduce those costs, the higher the vaccination rate is going to be.
Right.
One thing that's proved to be an effective assistant to that is the fact that a lot of states now allow pharmacists to give vaccines without a prescription, or to effectively prescribe vaccines themselves. So all vaccines in the United States are prescription drugs, and that's a determination that's made by the FDA.
Okay.
There's been an argument made that certain things like Flunase or Flumist that are, you can't really abuse a nasal vaccine spray. You can take 100 of them and it won't have any terrible effect on you. So there's an argument that those should not require a prescription.
Right.
That argument has not carried the day yet, so they still do. But for most vaccines in most states, you can go to a pharmacist, and you don't necessarily have to see a doctor and get a doctor to say, okay, this child needs this course of vaccines. You go to the pharmacist, and they can do that for you.
There are a lot of pharmacies that are now incorporating small little miniature health clinics there as well, that are usually staffed by nurse practitioners that are able to kind of fill that need for those particular states that don't have the ability for pharmacists just to go ahead and prescribe a vaccine off the shelf. So that's pretty handy, and a lot of those actually do take insurance. So what do you think are some legal... What do you think it's going to take for us to kind of get this whole vaccine crisis with the anti-vaxxers under very, very strict control? Is it without, I know people worry about body autonomy. I should be able to say what happens to my body, but this isn't like...
Right, that goes back to the person who doesn't want to wash their hands.
Yes.
They work for a restaurant and they're handling your food.
Right.
So bodily autonomy, there's an argument for that, and there's an argument for there to be limitations to that.
Right.
If someone wants to go and stab another person on the street, well, they can say, well, I'm using my body to stab someone. I'm exercising my bodily autonomy. But that's not an argument that's going to carry the day. In terms of vaccines, I think I mentioned to you earlier, Arizona has some proposals. A lot of states are proposing to reduce exemptions, eliminate philosophical exemptions. Arizona has some people in their legislature that want to go the opposite way and expand exemptions. And that's kind of surprising in the current environment of an ongoing outbreak.
Right.
But one of the things that they have proposed, which I find intriguing, is to allow antibody testing to determine whether someone already has the antibodies that the vaccine is intended to mediate.
And that's a pretty simple test. That shouldn't be difficult at all.
Right. And, there's some concern that there could be false positives, but those tend to be rare. And I think, there are ways to control for that. So that I would generally be in favor of states saying, well, first of all, Michigan, for example, requires that if you want to get an exemption from vaccination that's not a medical exemption, that you have to receive some education. You have to sit down with a medical professional who explains how vaccines work. And, a lot of states don't require anything like that. I think that would be something that would be helpful if all states that have exemptions, other than medical exemptions, were to require that people seeking such exemptions get some information from someone who's really competent to provide it. And then secondly, I think it would be helpful to require, actually, that parents who want to exempt their children from vaccination have the children tested for antibodies. And that would have kind of two effects. One being, if there are children who have, through some exposure, already developed antibodies and don't need the vaccination for a particular illness, that kind of moots it for that issue. But for a lot of other parents, they're going to learn the kind of harsh truth that your child has no antibodies for this disease. They are right now 100% vulnerable to it, and that's something that they would have to think about in terms of deciding whether they want their child to continue in the world with that vulnerability.
See, I find it pretty interesting because there's, for this mentality, and I actually joined a Facebook page of about 30,000 people, and I suspect a lot of those are just looky-loos and kind of lurking around, but the things that they post there, they think that a lot of what they think is this is supposed to be a natural part of life, that you're exposed to these diseases in this way, and this is supposed to help you actually develop your immunity in an all-natural kind of way. But bear attacks are all natural. Snake venom is all natural. That doesn't, just because it happens in an all-natural way doesn't mean that it's better or safer. And
if you read biographies of people from the 18th and 19th centuries, they often say something like, this person had 6 children, 3 of whom survived.
Yes, that's why they had so many kids. Because I
was actually reading a biography of someone who had lived in, I think it was a medical report of someone who had lived in, they were around in 1904, 1905, and it said they had 5 children, 3 of whom survived, 1 died from measles, 1 died from diphtheria.
Yes.
And that's the way that the world used to be, is that,
right,
you would have a large number of children, and several of them would die from one of these contagious diseases,
right,
that for which we now have a vaccine. So that is what is technically natural, is for a lot of children to die of infectious diseases. What we're doing as a society in vaccinating them and therefore preventing these massive numbers of deaths is unnatural, but that's what makes it civilization.
Yeah, and the thing is, some of it is kind of natural because they usually tend to be deactivated versions of the real thing. So I think a large portion of this is people not understanding how the immune system works and not understanding that everything can kill you. Dosage matters. Just because you have chemicals, and you have chemicals in everything. You eat chemicals. It's called sugar, carbohydrates.
Yes.
Those are all chemicals. There's toxic and non-toxic. And
someone had mentioned to me recently that they had heard that that the chicken eggs that vaccines are, a lot of vaccines are cultured in chicken eggs, and so they heard that the chicken eggs had glyphosate in them from Roundup. And that was a concern, and then glyphosate is a concern. But I pointed out, well, if you're concerned about glyphosate in eggs, then you really should be concerned about just eggs themselves, as opposed to the really tiny amount of egg that you get in a vaccine. There are many other vectors through which eggs get into our system. If you're not a vegan and never eat anything with egg in it.
Yeah. Well, and also the glyphosate argument, you have to be, according with the latest court case involving that, all of the data that we have does not definitively show that it causes cancer, but it
Right.
could be in a ridiculously high amount that this man exposed himself to without the proper gear. Perhaps that's a thing. But if it's used according to its directions, then that should not be an issue at all. But in a court,
Right.
maybe you can explain how a court case is different than like scientific fact, because the rules for winning a case is far different than what the scientific community would hold to be. This is the thing that's happening now, or this is what the evidence supports. So evidence for like scientific findings and conclusions that are supported by evidence is far different than like court case evidence. Maybe you can kind of clarify that.
Well, the purpose of science and the purpose of litigation, although ideally they're both trying to find the truth, they go about it in very different ways. Litigation is an adversarial process. You have two people who are opposed to each other, and they're each trying to prove that the other one is wrong. And they're really not necessarily trying to get to the truth, because sometimes the truth is something that's bad for one of them, and they want to kind of suppress it from coming up in the court. But also, the way court cases work, there are just a tremendous amount of things that the parties stipulate to. Two parties can go into court, and for the purpose of the case, they can stipulate that the earth is flat. And the court has to treat that as though it's true for purposes of that case. Right. So there's no scientific reality in terms of what people say. Okay, we don't want to contest this as an issue, whether it's right or wrong. We're going to assume that that's the way it is. Also, in cases where there is a scientific component, where there's a question of whether an illness was caused by a particular substance that you were exposed to, the way it works is each side will get their expert witness, and the expert witnesses will testify. And there's some concern. People say, well, the expert witness is paid, and therefore they're paid to take one view or the other. And I think that's a little uncharitable. I think it's possible to find someone who will testify as an expert who genuinely believes what they're testifying to is the truth. But you can get you can get two expert witnesses, and one's testifying that the earth is round and the other is testifying that the earth is flat. And when it comes to convincing a jury, or possibly even a judge, there's a tremendous amount of, well, who's the more charismatic expert? Who's the
expert that the jury likes?
Yeah.
Isn't that the way?
There's a great quote that a jury trial is a contest to determine which lawyer is more likable.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of have to go with that. When I was looking at with the glyphosate, that particular, I wrote my own little article, my own piece on my website, talking about the problems associated, how some people think court case means synonymous with scientific fact, and it doesn't. It doesn't at all mean the same thing. You just have to convince a jury that glyphosate played a role in this man getting cancer. The addition of it didn't necessarily have to be the cause, but the addition of it, that one little variable amongst all the other things, he likely had a gene for it, but that one little variable was enough to tip the scales over into him getting cancer. And that's kind of what my understanding is in regard to the jury-based trials versus, when people see that, like, oh, well, it must cause cancer, a jury awarded all this money. No.
Well, I will say that over the course of history, I think juries have tended to get things right. I think judges have tended to get things right. There's certainly specific cases you can look at and say, well, they got that completely wrong. But if you look at an aggregate of a large number of cases, they do tend to get things right. And I will also very specifically say, now I mentioned early on that I worked for the court that had appellate review over the vaccine injury cases. There is a body within the Court of Federal Claims that's called the Vaccine Special Masters. And if you're injured by a vaccination, or you're asserting that you're injured by a vaccination in the United States, you can't sue the manufacturer, because we don't want lawsuits to drive vaccine makers out of business. So there's a fund that's set up. It's administered by the special masters. They hear the case. They examine the expert witnesses and the claimants, and they have years and years of experience generally in dealing specifically with vaccine injury claims and the kinds of cases that are brought up and the kinds of injuries that are asserted to be caused by vaccines. And they're very good at what they do, and they generally get it right. And I should also mention that the way that the program works, the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which is the genesis of this court, you don't actually have to prove that you have an injury that was caused by a vaccine, which is what you would have to prove in a civil court. You just have to prove that you received a vaccination, and then within a certain proximate period of time, either a certain injury developed, whether it's a vasovagal syncope or anaphylaxis or some reaction or redness and swelling in the area of the vaccination. And if you just can show, okay, I received a vaccination and I had one of these list of responses to it within a certain time set forth in the statute, you get compensation, whether you've proved there was any actual causation or not. And if you have a claim of an injury that is not one of the ones that are listed on the table, you can still be compensated for it. You just have to prove that proximity, plus you have to prove that there is kind of a reasonable scientific theory as to why that would be an injury that could be traced to the vaccination. They had a proceeding in the mid-2000s over the autism cases. There were, after Wakefield's article, there were thousands of cases filed where parents say, well, my child was vaccinated, and within some period of time after the vaccination, they showed signs of autism, which, incidentally, children who aren't vaccinated show signs of autism at exactly the same time of their life. And the special masters said, okay, what we're going to do is, out of these thousands of cases, we're going to ask the plaintiff's attorneys to pick the three strongest cases, the ones that they think have the best evidence, and we're going to try them with the expert witnesses and examine all the evidence and all the expert testimony and everything that can come down from that. And the special masters determined that there was no causation proved in any of those cases. There was no reasonable scientific theory of a connection proved in any of those cases. So there was no recovery, and that is the rule that now applies in the Court of Federal Claims before these special masters. There's been one case where someone was found to have had encephalitis consequent to vaccination and developed symptoms consistent with autism as a result of encephalitis, but not a case where someone's found to have developed autism as a result of vaccination.
And there's also been a large meta-analysis that involved like millions of children over the course of 10 years to show that there's no definitive link between autism and vaccines. I'm curious, you mentioned about the fund. There's a website where you can go and make a claim that you've had a vaccine injury. And a lot of anti-vaxxers use that particular website to say, see all of these different injuries that are caused by vaccines. But they don't go back, and I forget the name of the website, you probably remember, but they don't go back and double check to see what the outcomes were.
Well, this is VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System.
Yes.
Which is also hosted by the Centers for Disease Control. And in fact, there's anybody, vaccine manufacturers are required to report serious incidences that they become aware of, and physicians, although they're not legally required, are ethically required to report vaccine injuries that they become aware of. But anybody in the world can report an injury. In fact, there was an autism researcher named Dr. James R. Laidler, who became so frustrated with the fact that people were filing these frivolous claims through VAERS, that he actually filed a claim saying that he received a flu vaccination which caused him to turn into the Incredible Hulk. And he was contacted by the CDC, and they said, listen, we have to review all claims of a serious adverse response to a vaccination, and we would consider, not everybody necessarily would, but we would consider turning into the Incredible Hulk to be a serious adverse response. And they told him, it would be embarrassing for us to have to investigate this and make a permanent record of it. And he voluntarily withdrew the claim, which he didn't have to do. There could be, if he hadn't done that, there would be sitting in the records of the CDC, a record that a flu vaccination had caused someone to turn into the Incredible Hulk. And there was a big spike right after Wakefield's report. There was a big spike of claims like that, and it turned out that they weren't being made by manufacturers, they weren't being made by physicians, they weren't being made by the parents or caretakers of the children. They were being made by plaintiffs' counsel,
right,
who were preparing to file a vaccine injury claim. Incidentally, VAERS data or VAERS reports are inadmissible as evidence in the Court of Federal Claims. You simply can't use them as evidence because they're so open and unreliable. It's kind of the way that your teacher won't let you cite Wikipedia on your paper.
Yes. Oh goodness, Wikipedia is not a reputable source. Why
well,
not?
I think it's pretty good.
It's good as a starting point.
It's wonderful. The best Wikipedia articles, the ones that are the most well written, the most thoroughly researched, are really, really good sources of information. But there's a lot of stuff out there that where the article is best looked at as a jumping off point to look at, well, what sources do they cite,
right,
and how good are those sources.
See,
but I love Wikipedia. I can get lost in it for hours.
See, I like to do stuff like that, to where like my different shows, because I have very different shows that I do, but I always like to direct it, like, go to my website, here's all my sources, they're right there, you can go dig down a bit deeper and get lost in it if you want and learn more about it. So
all my sources are in my book. In
your book. You want me to take a picture of you with your book, and then I can hold it up there if you want to hold your book up. I can post
sure,
that.
I can do that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
There's the chapter on state laws alone.
I'll put that one up.
Okay. The chapter on the state laws alone has 2,000 footnotes, almost.
You have 2,000 footnotes?
In one chapter.
Oh, boy, you are thorough, man. You're just like, I'm going to be the king of footnotes. Is there a Guinness record for that, I wonder?
Well, I'm sure there's someone who's put down more footnotes. So the point is not to say, okay, I want to have a lot of footnotes. The point is to say, for every single thing that I say, I'm not really expressing my opinion. I'm saying this is the way it is here. This is the way it is here. This is what you're required to do under these circumstances. This is what you can do in terms of just every one of these areas in terms of reporting for any of these things.
All right, so I'm going to put that picture of you with your book up. So you look like you were about to say something really important holding this book. That's his book, Vaccination and Immunization Law. You can also find him on Twitter, Brian_Abramson, and all of his links are in the description. And if you have questions for him, he's really good about answering questions on Twitter and social media and all that sort of thing. And he's an advocate for vaccination, but only if, it is appropriate for you. And we've got to close these freaking loopholes. There should be no philosophical exemption. It's just
I don't even characterize myself as being an advocate for vaccination, because my primary goal is to have people informed about what the law of vaccination is. But, as I said, you cannot talk about the history of the law and the history of how it developed without pointing out the kind of raw fact that the number of people dying from specific diseases is directly correlated with either the absence or the presence of vaccination.
Right.
And that the cases where courts have looked at a lot of the claims revolving around the idea that vaccines are harmful and so forth have resulted in determinations that by and large they are not.
Right.
And there is a vaccine injury compensation system for a reason, because there are, in very rare circumstances, there are actually injuries. But, I like to point out to people that Justice Scalia wrote an opinion in a case called Brunswitz v. Wyeth, which is the seminal case immunizing vaccine manufacturers from lawsuits asserting harms caused by the vaccines. And Scalia wrote in that opinion that vaccines are a victim of their own success. They've been so effective in preventing the harms of diseases that people have forgotten about the diseases and have come to worry about the harms of the vaccines.
Right.
And that's, it's striking because you think of Justice Scalia as being someone who would be very far in favor of, a sort of autonomy against government intrusion in that area. But he was very stalwart in saying that the vaccine manufacturers should be exempt for the purpose of ensuring the supply of vaccines for the population.
I have a really quick question. So that vaccine injury fund, where did those funds actually come from? There's
an excise tax on vaccines. Every vaccine that you receive, everybody, every level of vaccine, 75 cents goes to the fund.
Wow. Well, that's a smart way to do it. That's a pretty smart way to do it. So and I didn't even realize that was a thing. So I've learned a lot speaking with you today.
Well, thank you.
We're coming up on over an hour, even with all of our technical difficulties. We've managed to pound out a really good episode of This Week in BS. I'd love to have you back on the show sometime to talk a bit and see what's going on with the latest. I think we can
find more things to talk about.
Oh, we probably can, yeah. But do check out Brian Abramson's Twitter. He updates regularly about the current news on vaccination law, and I think it's going to be legislation. That's what it's going to take in order to seal off this vaccine crisis we're having, especially with all of these outbreaks that are occurring in measles and the adenovirus, all these different things. We need to kind of one more question that was posed for on the trailer for the show. Somebody asked about immigrants. All of these immigrants, these immigrants coming to the country that are bringing all these diseases. It was like he wasn't trying to be rude or anything. It's like this is a genuine concern that people have. So I think you and I had like a similar solution to that, which is what?
Well, if you're concerned that immigrants are going to bring in infectious diseases, then the first and foremost thing that you should do is be vaccinated against diseases that you expect might be brought in.
There you go.
it bears noting. I mentioned the outbreak in New York that was caused by a tourist from Israel or a visitor from Israel. Most, to the extent, and this was mentioned in the congressional hearing yesterday, to the extent that infectious diseases are brought into this country from other countries, primarily the biggest vector in the cases where the actual source has been traced back have been people who are legally coming into the country for one reason or another, often cases of American tourists traveling to another country and becoming infected with something and then bringing it back themselves. So that's actually kind of a bigger concern. But another kind of end to that is, if you really want to ensure that people coming into this country, legally or not, are not bringing in diseases like measles and mumps and polio and so forth, then we should be really robust in ensuring that other countries also carry out vaccination programs against those. One of the things that was mentioned in the congressional hearing was the possibility that was the fact that measles was eliminated in the United States for some years and then came back. And there's a possibility that the measles virus itself could be eradicated from the face of the earth. And we know this because smallpox was eradicated through a very stringent program of vaccination in every country. They did what was called ring vaccination. Whenever there was a smallpox case, they would vaccinate that entire population and a ring around it. And they did that until every last case of smallpox had been eliminated and the disease simply no longer exists. So if we were able to do that with measles and polio, which are two diseases which are theoretically eradicable, then you wouldn't need vaccinations for measles and polio anymore, just the same way that you don't get vaccinated for smallpox anymore. So if you really, really are opposed to vaccination, then you should want a very intensive campaign of vaccination to wipe out these diseases, so in the future no vaccination for them is needed.
That's a good plan too. Well, I guess we're going to wrap up here. It's been over an hour now. Thank you so much. Let me see if there's any questions. We can take a few questions if you have any in the chat before we get up. Somebody said they wanted your book, and I think Miss Narkey said she wanted your book to be in all the hotels, like the Gideons. Thank you.
I would love that. The book is a little bit on the pricey side. That's not up to me. That's up to the publisher. It's probably not the typical consumer book.
What about a Cliff Notes version?
Oh, I will definitely think about
a Cliff Notes version for the Gen Pop, as I would say, the general population. That might be interesting. I would love to take a look at your book. I might go and see if I can get a copy and have a gander through it and have a chat next time about pick your brain about what I find. If that would be cool.
It would. I don't know if you've actually looked at the price, but I don't want you to get sticker shock.
Well, I can probably go to my local university, sit down, and say, "Let me just have a look," and then just kind of skim through. Okay.
It has been put on the shelves in a couple of law schools.
Okay.
According to WorldCat, so you might be able to find it somewhere.
I might be able. Okay, that's cool. Is there a digital version? Because I might still have access to digital through my old university.
There is not, I'm afraid. But
Oh, and by the way, his camera is not frozen. It's just the video completely went away for whatever reason. I can't get it to go through OBS. That's why I've just been putting these really cool, like, still shots of him, like right there. And so I've just been changing in between still shots. So you can get the various angles of Brian Abramson. So
someone said in the comments that smallpox still shows up in some communities. Actually, it's not. It is completely eradicated. However, there are related diseases, cowpox and chickenpox, which people sometimes conflate with smallpox. And, chickenpox is varicella. That's the one that we had an outbreak of in North Carolina last year. So, no, smallpox is gone.
Is it still in some third world countries, though, or has it been eradicated there?
No, it has been completely eradicated from the earth. And it's remarkable that, the countries of the earth kind of came together long enough to be able to do that, to make that happen. Even in war zones and so forth, they managed to carry out that program. So the smallpox, the virus itself, it is extinct. The only places that it exists, they have small samples in some labs in case, in theory, in case someone makes a weaponized version and they can come out with a vaccine for it really quickly. That's actually something that was mentioned in the congressional hearing, is a concern that if the population of people who are vaccinated for measles drops too low, then enemies of the United States could weaponize measles against the United States because, we would become vulnerable to that as a biological weapon.
I mean,
and we're not at that stage, but certainly
it's something
if we went from like the 90s to the 70s in terms of percent of the people who are vaccinated, then we would definitely become vulnerable to an attack like that.
Oh gosh. Maybe that's an entirely different episode. All the different ways that anti-vaxxers are counterproductive and encourage bioterrorism from other countries.
That is, it's something we're thinking about.
Yeah.
Just in terms of national defense.
Yeah, I would imagine that would probably be a thing. Well, I'm going to take this moment to thank you. Thank you, Brian, for hopping on this show. I am very sorry that the video started acting crazy. But guys, go check him out on Twitter. He's there. If you can, get your hands on his book. Check it out. And if you just have questions, ping him on Twitter. At him. If you're curious about the links, you can look in the description. Click on his Twitter, find where his book is, check out what he's done. He's actively involved in vaccination law, so the man knows what he's talking about. So maybe just give a listen if you're an anti-vaxxer. I guess we'll just kind of wrap it up. Any final thoughts?
No, I just want to thank you very much for having me on your podcast. I had a wonderful time, and I feel like we had a really useful conversation.
I had a great time too, even navigating all of our technical. I swear it's not one of my shows if I don't have a technical difficulty of some time, but we navigated it just fine, I feel, and had a really, really good talk. And I learned a lot of things, and I hope you guys learned a lot of things too. So like, share, and subscribe. Get the word out. Let people learn about what vaccination law actually entails and what the loopholes are and what we need to close up, and vote for congressmen and women that are all about herd immunity and willing to close up those loopholes. That's really important because it's becoming a crisis. So we need to get on top of that. So thank you again. Thank you, Brian. Come back anytime.
Anytime.
And thank you guys for watching. You have a great night.